September 10, 1944. British Airborne Headquarters. The decision was already in motion. A young intelligence officer sat alone at a desk, bent over reconnaissance photographs, a magnifying glass pressed to the paper. Major Brian Urquhart was 25 years old. His job was narrow and technical. Identify threats to airborne landings. Nothing more. He had been doing it quietly for weeks. What he saw that morning was not ambiguous. Beneath the tree cover outside Arnhem were armored silhouettes. Not trucks. Not abandoned vehicles. Tanks. Heavy ones. German Panzer formations, stationary, concealed, intact. The shapes matched what other reports had already suggested. 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting in the area, exactly where British paratroopers were scheduled to land. 7 days remained before the operation. Urquhart gathered the photographs and left his office. The plan he was about to challenge had already been approved at the highest levels. Operation Market Garden was not a proposal anymore. Aircraft had been allocated. Airborne divisions had been assigned. Political capital had been spent. The decision to proceed was assumed, not debated. He laid the photographs on a senior officer's desk and explained what they showed. German armor in the drop zones. Units capable of annihilating lightly armed airborne troops within hours. The implication was direct. Landing there would not be a battle. It would be destruction. The response was immediate and dismissive. The photographs were barely examined. The conclusion was reached without discussion. The Germans were beaten. These were remnants. The operation would go ahead. Urquhart persisted. That persistence became the problem. Within hours, the issue was no longer the tanks. It was him. His warnings were reclassified as pessimism. His certainty was labeled emotional strain. By the end of the day, a decision was made that did not alter the operation in any way. Major Brian Urquhart was ordered to take leave for nervous exhaustion. The plan remained unchanged. The aircraft would fly. The paratroopers would jump. The warning was removed. That was the decision. In early September 1944, the military situation in Western Europe briefly aligned in a way that almost never occurs in war. German forces were retreating in disorder. Command structures were fractured. Fuel shortages immobilized entire units. The defensive line that had consumed Allied planning for years no longer existed in any meaningful form. From a purely military perspective, the moment presented a narrow but real opportunity. Airborne forces could be used to seize critical infrastructure before the enemy could reorganize. Bridges mattered more than territory. Control of crossings over rivers and canals would determine the pace of any advance into Germany itself. The logic behind Operation Market Garden was not irrational on paper. Airborne troops would land deep behind German lines, capture a chain of bridges across the Netherlands, and hold them long enough for ground forces to drive through and link up. If successful, Allied armor would bypass prepared defenses, cross the Rhine intact, and enter the German industrial heartland before winter. Speed was the currency of the plan. Everything depended on tempo. German formations had to be too weak or too slow to react. Airborne troops needed only to delay, not defeat, whatever resistance appeared. Ground forces had to advance along a single highway with no serious interruption. The window was measured in hours, not days. There was nothing inherently reckless about using airborne forces in this way. Earlier operations had proven they could seize bridges and hold them temporarily against larger forces. The Germans themselves had demonstrated the concept in 1940. The risk lay not in the idea, but in the assumptions that supported it. The most critical assumption was enemy weakness. Allied intelligence assessments circulating at higher command levels described German forces in the Netherlands as shattered remnants. Units retreating from France. Training formations. Elderly reservists. The belief was that any armored formations had either been destroyed or withdrawn far to the east. If that assessment were correct, Market Garden had a plausible chance of success. Light infantry facing disorganized defenders could hold long enough. The narrow road, while dangerous, would be uncontested. The airborne divisions would not be asked to fight tanks with rifles. Another assumption was reaction time. German command, it was believed, no longer had the capacity for rapid operational response. Communications were degraded. Commanders were overwhelmed. Even if resistance appeared, it would be fragmented and uncoordinated. From this perspective, the operation did not require perfection. It required confusion on the enemy side and confidence on the Allied side. And in September 1944, confidence was abundant. What was militarily possible at that moment was not a guaranteed breakthrough, but a calculated gamble based on speed, surprise, and temporary enemy paralysis. The gamble depended entirely on intelligence accuracy, not optimism, not reputation, not morale. Accuracy. If German armor was absent, the plan was dangerous but viable. If armored divisions were present in strength, the airborne landings would fail immediately. There was no middle ground. This is where the opportunity becomes clear in hindsight. The Allies did not lack options. They lacked willingness to reassess assumptions once the operation had been emotionally and politically committed. Militarily, the correct response to contradictory intelligence would have been delay, revision, or relocation of drop zones. None of those required abandoning the concept entirely. The opportunity was real, but conditional. It existed only if the enemy matched the picture Allied leaders had already chosen to believe. That belief would not be tested in a briefing room. It would be tested on the ground, by men landing with rifles in the presence of tanks. Brian Urquhart did not arrive at his conclusions suddenly, and he did not arrive at them emotionally. His warning was the product of methodical work carried out over weeks, following procedures that existed precisely to prevent airborne disasters. As an intelligence officer assigned to British Airborne Corps, his responsibility was narrow but critical. Before airborne operations, someone had to determine what would be waiting on the ground. Not what commanders hoped would be there. What was actually there? By early September 1944, Urquhart's assessments had already begun to diverge sharply from the prevailing narrative. While senior planners spoke confidently about a shattered German army, his desk was accumulating reports that pointed in the opposite direction. Individually, none of them were decisive. Together, they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. The first stream of information came from intercepted German communications. Ultra-decrypts indicated that two SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and the 10th, had not been destroyed in France, as many assumed. They were moving north. Their losses were being repaired. Their equipment was being replaced. Most importantly, their destination was the Netherlands, not Germany proper. These were not second-line formations. They were armored divisions with combat experience, operational headquarters, and surviving cohesion. Their presence alone did not guarantee disaster, but it fundamentally changed the risk calculation for any airborne landing. The second stream came from the Dutch resistance. Their reports were inconsistent in detail, but consistent in substance. Armored vehicles moving at night. Tank tracks on secondary roads. German units establishing camps near Arnhem rather than passing through it. These reports were often discounted by higher command as unreliable or exaggerated. Urquhart did not dismiss them. He compared them. The third stream was the most damning. Aerial reconnaissance photography. Clear, high-resolution images taken by low-flying aircraft. They showed armored silhouettes beneath tree cover. They showed vehicles positioned deliberately, not abandoned. They showed camouflage discipline consistent with trained units expecting to be concealed, not routed remnants waiting to surrender. Urquhart did not rely on a single photograph. He cross-referenced multiple sorties. He matched locations to planned drop zones. He compared vehicle dimensions to known German tank profiles. The conclusion did not require interpretation. German armor was present in strength in the exact areas British airborne troops were scheduled to land. He prepared his warning accordingly, not as a dramatic appeal, as a staff assessment. He did not argue ideology or personality. He argued probability. Light infantry landing without anti-tank support would be immediately engaged by mechanized forces. Their radios would be targeted. Their assembly would be disrupted. Their mission timelines would collapse before ground forces could reach them. He also understood the institutional risk of delivering this assessment. Airborne operations were inherently political by this stage of the war. They symbolized initiative, daring, and momentum. Questioning one was not merely questioning a plan. It was questioning the narrative of victory itself. Urquhart still pressed forward. He did not exaggerate. He did not speculate. He presented evidence and recommended reconsideration of drop zones or postponement. He expected argument. He expected scrutiny. He did not expect dismissal. When his warning was rejected, he did not retreat. He reiterated it through proper channels. Each repetition made him more isolated. Each refusal to soften his assessment made him less acceptable. What followed was not a refutation of his evidence, but a reframing of his credibility. His certainty was described as rigidity. His insistence became anxiety. His professionalism was reinterpreted as strain. In the end, no one disproved his analysis. No one replaced it with a better one. They simply removed the analyst. Urquhart's warning was complete, documented, and accurate. It was also incompatible with a decision that had already been made. That incompatibility sealed its fate. When the operation began, his preparations would prove unnecessary. There would be no time for analysis once the parachutes opened. The rejection of Brian Urquhart's warning did not occur because senior commanders failed to understand it. It occurred because accepting it would have forced them to unravel a decision that had already become politically irreversible. By the time Urquhart delivered his assessment, Operation Market Garden was no longer a military proposal. It was a commitment. Aircraft schedules had been locked. Airborne divisions had been assigned. Supply priorities had been shifted away from American ground forces to support a British-led thrust. Most importantly, reputations were now attached to the plan's success. At the center of this pressure sat Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. For weeks, he had argued that a single decisive blow under British command could end the war by Christmas. This was not merely strategy. It was a statement aimed at Allied politics. American armies were advancing rapidly across France, capturing cities, drawing headlines, and dominating public perception. British forces, moving more cautiously, risked appearing secondary in a war they had entered years earlier. Market Garden was Montgomery's answer to that imbalance. It promised speed, decisiveness, and a dramatic crossing of the Rhine. It also required absolute confidence. Any public doubt would weaken the argument that priority resources should be diverted to his command. That confidence extended downward through the command structure. Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, deputy commander of the operation, had personally committed his reputation to the airborne plan. His headquarters had been involved in shaping drop zones, timelines, and assumptions. Acknowledging the presence of German armored divisions at Arnhem would not simply complicate planning. It would expose that planning as fundamentally flawed. Institutionally, there was no safe way to absorb that revelation. If Urquhart was correct, then intelligence assessments at multiple levels had failed. Reconnaissance interpretation had failed. Assumptions shared between Allied commands had failed. And senior officers would have to explain why thousands of men had been placed at risk based on optimism rather than verification. The system responded in the only way it knew how. It protected itself. Rather than challenge the operation, senior staff reframed the problem. The intelligence was not wrong. The officer presenting it was. His conclusions were described as excessively cautious. His insistence was portrayed as emotional involvement rather than professional judgment. The language shifted deliberately, away from facts and toward temperament. This mechanism was not unique to Market Garden. Military institutions, especially during periods of momentum, are deeply resistant to disruptive information. Plans create gravity. Once movement begins, stopping it requires authority and political cover. Urquhart possessed neither. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower was aware of the risks surrounding Market Garden. His staff had raised concerns about reliance on a single road, the tight timetable, and the unpredictability of weather. But Eisenhower's role was not solely military. He was managing an alliance. British political leadership expected a major British-led operation. Churchill had backed Montgomery publicly and privately. Refusing the plan outright would have created friction at a moment when unity was considered paramount. Eisenhower calculated that even a risky success would justify the decision, while a failure could be absorbed as the cost of maintaining coalition harmony. Within that calculation, Urquhart's warning was an inconvenience. Addressing it would have required either postponing the operation or fundamentally altering it. Both options threatened the political balance Eisenhower was trying to maintain. So the warning was neutralized indirectly. No formal rejection was issued. No counter-analysis was produced. Instead, Urquhart himself was removed from the process under the pretext of health. The phrase, nervous strain, appeared in internal discussions, a bureaucratic tool with a long history. It implied concern without requiring proof. It discredited without argument. Once that label was applied, his evidence no longer needed to be addressed. Photographs could be ignored. reports could be sidelined. The chain of command remained intact, and the operation moved forward. This was not malice. It was institutional preservation. No one intended to sacrifice a division. They intended to preserve momentum, authority, and cohesion. The system assumed that uncertainty was more dangerous than risk. By removing the messenger, commanders insulated themselves from doubt. They could proceed believing that caution had been addressed, not suppressed. The plan regained its narrative purity. Confidence returned to briefings. Orders flowed without contradiction. In the final days before the operation, no senior officer revisited the Arnhem drop zones with fresh skepticism. No alternative landing areas were approved. No armored contingencies were planned for airborne units. The assumption of weak German resistance remained official truth. The overrule was complete, not by a single order, but by a series of small institutional choices, each defensible on its own, collectively catastrophic. When the aircraft began loading paratroopers, the warning still existed. It was filed, it was accurate, and it was no longer allowed to matter. On September 17, 1944, the operation moved from theory to consequence. Shortly after midday, the skies over the Netherlands filled with transport aircraft and gliders. Parachutes opened in orderly waves. From the air, it looked controlled, almost ceremonial. On the ground, the assumptions that had sustained the plan began collapsing immediately. British airborne troops did not land into confusion or retreat. They landed into organized resistance. German units were alert, mobile, and armed with weapons specifically designed to kill lightly equipped infantry. The drop zones near Arnhem were not empty spaces awaiting occupation. They were watched. Within hours, the first reports filtered upward. Radio traffic was disrupted. Units failed to assemble on schedule. German armored patrols appeared far sooner than expected. These were not improvised responses by a broken army. They were coordinated movements by experienced formations reacting exactly as Urquhart had predicted. The presence of SS Panzer divisions changed the character of the fighting instantly. British paratroopers carried rifles, light machine guns, and a limited number of anti-tank weapons intended for emergencies, not sustained engagement. German tanks carried high-explosive shells. The disparity was decisive. As British units attempted to move toward the Arnhem Bridge, they were slowed, diverted, or destroyed piecemeal. Roads that were supposed to be lightly defended became killing zones. German armor did not need to seek the paratroopers out. The airborne landings had announced their positions. German command reacted with speed that Allied planners had assumed no longer existed. Field Marshal Walter Model, whose headquarters was nearby by coincidence, immediately grasped the scale of the operation. He did not hesitate. Local commanders were given authority to act without waiting for higher approval. Armor, infantry, and artillery converged on the drop zones. At Arnhem itself, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost managed to seize the northern end of the bridge with a fraction of the force originally planned. His men dug in among buildings not designed for defense against heavy weapons. They waited for relief that the plan had promised would arrive within 48 hours. It never came. The single road that was meant to carry British armor north became a bottleneck almost immediately. German counterattacks cut it repeatedly. Destroyed vehicles blocked movement. Supply convoys stalled. Each delay compounded the next. The timetable that Market Garden depended upon disintegrated hour by hour. For the men at Arnhem, time stopped mattering. What mattered was survival. German tanks moved into firing positions and began methodical bombardment. Buildings collapsed. Ammunition dwindled. Casualties mounted. Medical care became impossible. Communications with higher command faded into silence. The Airborne Division had been asked to hold ground against forces it was never meant to face. This was not bravery overcoming odds. It was physics asserting itself. Rifles cannot stop tanks. Courage cannot substitute for armor. German forces did not rush. They did not panic. They reduced the pocket systematically. Infantry cleared buildings under cover of armored fire. Artillery registered targets. Each British position was isolated and destroyed in turn. Frost's force held longer than expected, not because relief was coming, but because German commanders chose caution over haste. By the fourth day, resistance at the bridge was effectively finished. Survivors were wounded, captured, or killed. The bridge itself remained in German hands, intact and unusable to the Allies. The central objective of the operation was lost, even as fighting continued elsewhere. South of Arnhem, other airborne units faced similar realities on a smaller scale. American forces achieved some of their objectives, but their success could not compensate for the failure at the northern end of the corridor. The operation was not additive. One failure invalidated all gains. Attempts to reinforce the British Airborne Division came too late and in insufficient strength. Polish paratroopers were dropped into contested zones under fire, suffering heavy losses with little effect. Gliders carrying heavy equipment landed among German positions. Supplies fell into enemy hands. By the time higher command acknowledged the scale of the disaster, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The question was no longer whether Arnhem could be held, but how many men could be extracted without complete annihilation. On the night of September 25th, under cover of darkness and rain, the remnants of the British 1st Airborne Division withdrew across the Rhine. It was not an evacuation in the traditional sense. It was a survival movement. Wounded men were left behind. Equipment was abandoned. Units dissolved into fragments. Of the approximately 10,000 men who had landed near Arnhem, fewer than a quarter escaped. The rest were dead, wounded, or captured. An entire division ceased to exist as a fighting force. These outcomes were not the result of bad luck or unforeseeable events. Each consequence traced directly back to the original decision to proceed without revising assumptions. The German armor that destroyed the airborne units was the same armor identified in reconnaissance photographs a week earlier. The rapid German response was the same capability dismissed as impossible. The failure of the ground advance was the logical outcome of relying on a single exposed route. Even as the operation collapsed, the narrative at higher levels lagged behind reality. Reports were filtered. Language softened. Setbacks were described as delays. The word failure was avoided until it became unavoidable. When the operation officially ended, the numbers were stark. Over 17,000 Allied casualties across the operation. Thousands of prisoners. No crossing of the Rhine. No breakthrough into Germany. No acceleration of the war's end. What had been sold as a decisive stroke became an object lesson in what happens when institutional momentum overrides intelligence. The battlefield did not punish optimism. It punished error. For the men who landed at Arnhem, the consequence was final and personal. They fought an enemy they had been assured was not there. They waited for relief that could never arrive. They died inside a plan that had already rejected the information that might have saved them. The massacre was not sudden. It unfolded over days, methodically, predictably, and in direct alignment with the warning that had been set aside. The system did not collapse at Arnhem. It functioned exactly as designed. The cost of that function was paid in lives. In the years that followed, the record hardened. What had been chaotic in September 1944 became orderly in hindsight, stripped of urgency, and rewritten in official language. After the war, Allied commanders produced memoirs, reports, and justifications. Market Garden appeared in these accounts not as a failure of judgment, but as an ambitious gamble undermined by circumstances. Weather was cited. Terrain was cited. Timing was cited. Intelligence, when mentioned, was treated as an abstract shortcoming rather than a specific, documented warning. The existence of that warning did not disappear. It was simply minimized. Brian Urquhart returned to duty quietly. There was no inquiry into why he had been removed. No investigation into whether the diagnosis of nervous strain had been warranted. The issue was considered closed. In the post-war environment, reopening it would have required uncomfortable questions about responsibility. No one in a position of authority pursued those questions. Montgomery's own account framed the operation as partially successful. He described it as 90% achieved, emphasizing bridges taken in the South while avoiding sustained discussion of Arnhem. This formulation entered public discourse not because it was accurate, but because it was convenient. It allowed failure to be diluted without being denied outright. Within Allied headquarters, Market Garden quickly became a topic to be managed rather than examined. The war continued. Germany collapsed months later under overwhelming force. The scale of that final victory absorbed attention that might otherwise have lingered on earlier errors. Arnhem faded into the background. Only later, when documents were declassified and participants spoke with fewer institutional constraints, did the contours sharpen. Intelligence summaries confirmed the presence of the SS Panzer divisions near Arnhem. Reconnaissance photographs were rediscovered and reassessed. Dutch resistance reports were validated against German unit histories. The pattern was unmistakable. The intelligence had been correct. The warning had been specific. The consequences had followed precisely along the lines that had been predicted. Urquhart himself rarely spoke publicly about the episode in detail. When he did, his tone was restrained. He did not accuse individuals. He described process. He described how information moved upward, how it stalled, and how it was deflected. His later career, including senior roles in international diplomacy, suggested that the episode had not broken him, but it had marked him. German post-war accounts reinforced the same conclusion from the opposite side. Commanders described their surprise at the scale of the airborne landings, but not at the Allied choice of Arnhem. They confirmed that their armored units had been refitting nearby and were capable of immediate action. They described the operation not as a miracle resisted, but as an opportunity exploited. No Allied commander was formally censured for market garden. No promotion was reversed. No doctrine was publicly revised to acknowledge the specific failure of ignoring validated intelligence. The institutional lesson, if there was one, remained implicit. The men who died at Arnhem received memorials. The operation received books and films. The decision-making process received footnotes. What survived in the post-war record was not accountability, but narrative control. Market garden was framed as boldness undone by friction, not as a warning dismissed. The system protected its senior figures by allowing ambiguity to stand where clarity existed. Brian Urquhart did not need vindication in writing. The battlefield had already provided it. Every German tank that rolled into Arnhem was evidence. Every casualty figure reinforced the same conclusion. The post-war record did not contradict him. It simply took decades to say out loud what had been known before the aircraft ever took off. By the time that clarity emerged, it no longer threatened careers or alliances. It only explained graves. The record closed quietly. The decision remained what it had always been, a choice made in advance of evidence, sustained by authority, and confirmed by outcome. The case closes where it began, with a decision made before evidence was allowed to matter. Operation Market Garden did not fail because it was daring. It failed because doubt was treated as disloyalty and certainty was mistaken for competence. The plan survived not because it was sound, but because too many careers had already been invested in its success. Brian Urquhart was not ignored because he was wrong. He was ignored because he was inconvenient. His warning arrived at a moment when senior commanders no longer wanted information. They wanted confirmation. When he refused to provide it, the system removed him instead. No rule was broken. No order was disobeyed. Every step that led to Arnhem followed established procedures. That is what makes the outcome instructive. The catastrophe did not emerge from chaos. It emerged from normal functioning. Airborne troops landed exactly where they were told. German armor appeared exactly where intelligence had placed it. Relief forces advanced exactly as the timetable allowed. The result was not an accident. It was alignment. After the war, reputations endured. Promotions stood. Justifications were printed. The language softened. Failure was divided into percentages. Responsibility dissolved into circumstance. The men at Arnhem did not benefit from that accounting. What remains is a closed record, a warning documented, a decision sustained, a consequence delivered. Market Garden is remembered as a bridge too far. That description flatters the planners. The bridge was not too far. The truth was too close, and it was deliberately pushed aside. This was not a story of villainy. It was a demonstration of how institutions defend momentum at the expense of correction, how authority overrides analysis, how wars are not only lost on battlefields, but in rooms where silence becomes policy. Brian Urquhart survived the war. Thousands did not. The difference between them was not courage or competence. It was whether the system needed their voice. The case is closed. If you want more investigations into decisions that sent men forward while evidence was held back, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment if this record deserves to be remembered as more than a footnote.